Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Ryan Mcmaken, and Ryan Mcmaken is an editor. He worked for the Mises Institute. He's also a gifted economist and historian. Hello, Ryan. How are you doing?
Hello, Lipton. I'm very well. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, it's really great to have you on as a guest. I've been hunting you for some time now, Ryan. Ryan, you have an obsession with small states. Why are small states important? What's so special about small states? You even wrote a book, Breaking Away, the case for secession, radical decentralization, and smaller polities.
Well, of course, the issue of secession goes way back with the scholars at the Mises Institute, with Ludwig von Mises, with Murray Rothbard, and with the liberals in general, the 19th and 18th century. But what is the outcome of secession movements? Is that the outcome is generally smaller states because you're taking one state and breaking it into at least two smaller pieces. So I wanted to look a little bit more at what does that mean, right? Once we have this, assuming that there's some of these secession movements are successful, shouldn't we know a little bit more about what the deal is with the smaller states that result? And then, of course, there's just the issue of what is the optimal size of a state? Do you want mega states? Do you want smaller states? And we've made the point, not just myself, but Peter Saint-Onge had a good article on this a few years ago, looking at that in terms of GDP per capita and economic development. Smaller states tend to do better. They tend to be higher trust societies. They tend to be more cohesive. They avoid a lot of the sort of ethnic infighting that occurs in larger states. And they're often just simply more peaceful. State capacity tends to be higher, which isn't necessarily a libertarian thing, but it is a situation which, if you're going to have a state, they could at least be competent at maintaining infrastructure and roads and that sort of thing. And that tends to be better in smaller states as well, because you don't have these large scale conflicts over controlling resources or funneling resources to your particular region. And then, of course, there's just the moral issue, right? In a very large state, you're not going to have a uniform population that can agree on things like abortion, so that you can have big regional blocks then that can come to blows, that it sows hatreds and distrust over a lot of these what are considered non-negotiables in terms of moral policy. So there are many advantages to small states. The only downside I see is in terms of geopolitics. And that can be addressed often in terms of confederations and defense alliances and so on.
Ryan, why are small states richer? And what you're saying is empirically correct, because I have read recent studies saying that small states are richer, and these studies account for various racial groups and cultures. So even in Africa, smaller states have higher levels of economic freedom. So why is there such a strong correlation between small states and economic growth?
There's been a lot of good research that's come out on this. We should note, right, that prior to really the 90s, even very few studies on the size of states, and that we really only started to see empirical data, real research going on around the size of states after you started to get all this secession in the post-Cold War world. So it was after the Soviet Union broke up into 15 pieces, started to get people really interested in what's the deal with small states. And so what are the variables then involved? And this does relate then to what you bring up, right? In terms of, okay, is it good to be big or small in terms of GDP per capita and that sort of thing? What does the empirical data show? And it does vary depending on which study you read. I would say that, yes, you cannot say that on a blanket way, in a blanket way, small states everywhere do better, because the data does suggest that it needs to be adjusted for location, in that if you're a small state and you're near other states that engage in a lot of trade, um, that those smaller states are going to tend to do better. Why? They tend to be more nimble. They want to be more competitive. They tend to have lower taxation rates. But for small states that are just out on their own and they maybe are surrounded by illiberal states, they do not have even hope of access to trade agreements, to lots of flows in materials and goods, that they're not going to necessarily do well at all. So just being a small state is not just a cure-all, in that it needs to be the right environment. And so if you look though at Europe and the West, that does apply clearly in these cases, and we can see a number of examples. However, if you're in a part of Africa that is not near neighbors that can include it in a trade network, then you could find yourself in a lot of troubles. But the researchers did find that even in Africa, that there were benefits from being smaller, in the sense that it avoided a lot of the ethnic violence, infighting, gridlock that would occur. But again, I think we would end up we could do a whole show where we would essentially do literature reviews looking at different reports on that and looking at different empirical studies. And I do think there would be something to that in terms of value and just seeing what variables are key here. But certainly for people in North America, there would be significant benefits to breaking up the mega state that is the United States into smaller pieces, because it would still continue to have massive amounts of access to global markets, and that, if anything, this would improve its economic standing.
Ryan, small states are also better governed. Is this a consequence of the groups being more homogeneous in small states? Is that
I think in many cases,
okay?
yeah, I think not only are they more ethnically homogeneous, but they also, in many cases, are just more geographically and economically homogeneous, right? I mean, look at a country like Finland, right? 5 million people. Most people live within a couple hundred miles of the capital. So there's a lot of uniformity there. Yes, of course, they have some ethnic minorities in the north, and there's some linguistic minorities, but this is not significant. And so what you do then, you get a sense in these countries of much more of a feeling of our interests are all similar in terms of all members of the nation, because not only do we share a language group, but we all even live near each other and have common experiences that no American could claim to have on the national level. And so I think that bleeds through into just political discourse and in cultural feelings of unity. And you just don't have that in the United States. I think maybe you did for a period after World War II, just because the propaganda essentially of national unity was so successful in the 40s, and that lasted through the 1950s, but then clearly had broken down by the 1970s and has not really been resuscitated since.
Well, Ryan, I wrote an article for Chronicles some time ago exploring the link between immigration and social outcomes. And at some point, I'm going to pen a similar piece for Mises.org. But the truth, Ryan, is that diversity is negatively associated with trust. This this is the consensus in research. So even when people do argue that diversity is beneficial, they still admit that it is negatively associated with trust. The Cato Institute actually published a study touting the benefits of immigration, but that same study said that diversity has a negative impact on trust. And when you read the study closely, it's quite clear that the conclusion is following from that argument, because the writer then states that because of the trust issues surrounding diversity, there is that has a negative impact on government institutions. So we're more likely to have economic freedom. Something to that extent. I wrote the piece for Chronicles. So the writer did not conclude that trust is negative, but he said that economic freedom improves, etc. But if you read the article carefully, that's his argument. Due to the trust issues, people are less likely to trust the state.
Oh, yes, for
So that's
sure.
actually the link between the economic between economic freedom, diversity, and trust.
Yeah, I agree with you in general, right? You can't say that there's just a blanket benefit to a more diverse population. Now, of course, it depends on what we mean by diverse, right? I mean, all immigrants are not the same. And myself being descended from Mexican immigrants, when I look at Mexican immigrants coming into the southwestern United States, that's actually not a huge change to the status quo in terms of what's been going on since the 19th century, if not before. Um, this is not a big culture shock toward having a flow of migrant workers, population between these two areas. However, what if you were to bring in a large number of Muslim East Africans? I think that would be significantly different from having Christian Mexicans moving into Arizona or New Mexico or California. And I think that would breed significant distrust. And you could say, oh, well, that's just because people are racist or they're
No, it's not
intolerant and
because
so
they're
on.
racist. We
Well,
act-
it's because these are just different groups.
we actually have really great studies done by people in Sweden showing that in European countries, immigrants are more likely to commit crimes, and many of these immigrants are people from Middle Eastern and North African countries.
And you're not allowed to really criticize these groups just based on anything specific, right? And I joked with my co-host for War, Economy, and State podcast, Zach. We had an episode where we were actually pretty open to immigrants in our discussion, but that we still were probably going to be tarnished as being Islamophobes because we did make these distinctions between different types of immigrants, and that in terms of there is a geopolitical side to immigration that's almost always ignored in the discussion of it, because mostly you get economists talking about it where they're like, well, if we run the numbers, we can see that by bringing in more immigrants, you get more low-cost labor, and this drives up the standard of living and so on. Okay, assuming that's all true, but it nevertheless has other political implications, and geopolitical being one of them. We're seeing that right now in Asia and in Eurasia, where there are efforts to move people of your ethnicity into a neighboring state and then grant those people passports. This is called passportization, essentially, where you're moving populations around as part of a geopolitical strategy. And I don't buy into particular theories that Mexico is trying to recolonize the southwestern United States or anything like that. But that sort of thing has happened and can happen. And that is not something you just ignore by saying, oh, look at what happened to the economic growth when you had more immigrants. So you need to move beyond just the economic arguments and recognize that societies, they become low trust societies when you have a large variety of conflicting groups in them. Now, one way you can address that is the small state issue, or at least by using turn it into a confederation of sorts. So say you had a group of people, and this was Ludwig von Mises's view. Ludwig von Mises recognized that immigration brings with it political costs and political changes, that it's not just an economic argument. And he saw important cultural changes largely along linguistic lines. Being from Austria-Hungary, he saw that conflicts arose mostly through linguistic groups. I think you could look at it more broadly than that, but let's just say you have a large number of Spanish speakers, and they're tied to more Latin American culture. They move into a particular part of the United States. Well, ethnic enclaves tend to happen. Uh, Groups tend to like to live near other people in their groups or people they identify with and feel that they can trust. And we see that happen all the time. What you need then is to have the ability for those groups to have self-governance of their own for their particular region, their particular part of the country, so that they can then function within a confederation where they've got self-government, but without making large demands on people in neighboring regions. So if you had a situation where you had ethnic enclaves, but they were responsible for their own widows and orphans funds, their own welfare state, their own regulation, and so on, but were, say, still part of a larger geopolitical bloc, they obviously they wouldn't have any reason to be against the larger defense issues or geopolitical issues that the United States was involved in. But they nevertheless had some sort of their own local self-government. That would be a very different situation, and that would breed less conflict. And so that's a situation I look at a lot in the book as well. Not necessarily a scattering of fully independent states, but if that you're going to have a lot of religious, ethnic, linguistic diversity, that those people need some way of having their own self-government without being able to influence the politics of areas around them as well. So federalism, confederations, they're supposed to function in that way where, okay, we've got this part of the country that's Spanish speakers. And this is actually a reality in American history, right? Where New Mexico wasn't even majority English speaking until the 1912 or so. Where, okay, they're doing their own thing over there. They're part of the U.S. defense bloc and common market and all of that. But they're not requiring a whole lot from the U.S. population in general. And you could see that throughout European history, where you had German speakers who founded a lot of the major cities. They were able to obtain their own, what was called German town law, their own self-governance without being able to really affect the larger kingdoms that they were within. And so they were held as separate, although so long as they professed that they wouldn't rise in rebellion against the local king and stuff. So you really need to think in terms of not just mashing everybody into this mythical melting pot that we're told exists, but really giving populations as they move around the opportunity to engage in some sort of self-governance without demanding that they have a equal share of governance in whatever country that they're a part of in the larger way.
Ryan, so we're still on the topic of immigration, and Ilton Root, I interviewed him some time ago and I read one of his recent articles. And in that article, Ilton Root notes that in Western societies, change is initiated from the bottom up, not the top down, in the sense that in the West, people create guilds, universities, churches, merchant law, etc. And the problem with contemporary immigration in the United States is that immigrants are no longer being encouraged to assimilate. That's the first point. And the second point, as Lawrence Mead notes in his book, The Burden of Freedom, Europeans are individualistic. So when you relocate to a country like America, that's a performance-oriented country, an achievement-oriented country, and a time-oriented country, you're basically on your own. So in the United States, if you borrow $10 from your neighbor, you should pay him back. If I say, Ryan, meet me at 9, you will get that link by 7:30 or at 8. Many of these immigrants are coming from countries where long-term planning is not encouraged. And I've written on the topic for Mises. They get up and they just do business. And that's not how it works in America. And they're not being encouraged to assimilate, and that will pose future problems. What's your opinion?
I think part of that stems from the fact that the whole idea of migration, immigration has been nationalized as well. So when you do migrate to a new place, you're not encouraged to think of yourself as being part of a very specific community, which you should be. Instead of, oh, you're here, you're an American now. Well, what does that even mean? And who are your neighbors then? What does that mean? What community are you a part of? What community do you owe some sort of responsibility to? And because that all really only exists at the more localized level. Anything in terms of, hey, you're part of this community of 330 million Americans, that's a pure abstraction. That doesn't really mean much in terms of your real relations with people. And I think you can see how the Swiss handle that a lot better. When you do migrate to Switzerland, and of course, they've been changing this over time in a bad way, but traditionally over the last several decades, when you move to Switzerland, you're part of a specific canton or city. You're not just some vague Swiss thing. You then have to submit to local policy and local votes in terms of, will this person be naturalized? Will they obtain citizenship? And I think that matters. The fact that that's so localized matters. And what happened in the United States is immigration policy actually used to be pretty local. It was not seen as the policy of the federal government. I know that a lot of conservatives have pushed back on this. They're like, no, it says naturalization in there, and the federal government should always be in charge of it. Um, they're just straight wrong. The empirical reality of history in the United States is that it was not until the 1880s that the federal government started to assert itself in terms of immigration policy. Before then, it was the states themselves, as well as certain cities, who attempted to implement immigration policy. And this goes way back even to the 19th century, actually the 17th century in the United States, going back to the poor laws of England that had existed before the United States was a thing, of course. These were vagabond laws. So it was recognized that there would always be some poor people and that people would move around, but that these people would not be eligible for local welfare, because there was some of it in the 17th century even. They would not be eligible if they just showed up from somewhere else. So in order to be eligible for welfare, you had to be integrated into that community in some sense. And so there were these social benefit programs, but you just couldn't move around and get new pieces. So localizing things was seen as a method of really both integrating people, controlling people who were taking advantage of the system. And I think the United States would do well to do something similar in terms of, okay, you migrate to a specific state or to a specific metro area, and you have to make a go of it there, and you are part of this specific community. And you can't just go wherever in this giant United States. But the fact that it is all just this abstraction in terms of, oh, this is what the United States is now, and welcome to America, and just, now we have no idea what you're going to do, and you're not really part of any specific community. I don't think that helps at all, and I think a lot of other communities recognize that that's not really a good way to go about immigration. And then, of course, in the 19th century, they also had better policy in terms of that it was much more on an individual basis in terms of, are you an immigrant that is self-sufficient and going on about it. They moved later toward this idea of, well, we want immigrants from this country or from that country, and that there were certain quotas based on a country basis and so on. And that was all completely unheard of before the late 19th century. It was far more done on, okay, you showed up from some other place. We don't have an opinion about where you came from. However, we're going to attempt to do a bond program where someone has to vouch for you. A local has to vouch for you. And then if you just disappear into the interior or you go on welfare, then that person who vouched for you is going to have to pay a price in terms of forfeiting the bond. And we've actually tried to promote that idea more than once. It was actually pretty unenforceable in the 19th century, as you can imagine, because the United States was just so vast that people just disappeared into the agricultural interior. You never heard from them again. And the United States was so large and could absorb so many immigrants in the 19th century. It was really quite remarkable. And these people just moved to agricultural areas. There wasn't any sort of national welfare. And so many people went home because they did not succeed in an economic way. But in terms of the situation now, it would be much easier to enforce some sort of bond program and to really look at immigration on an individual basis. Because any country, right, you meet, say, I've known through graduate school and some other places, immigrants from Nigeria. And these people, they're always immaculately well educated, very well dressed.
Yeah, I know. I have a lot to say about the Nigerians, Ryan. But
Right?
continue.
They see. I read your articles on Nigeria, right? And they speak English, right? And they're Christians in many cases, and they're from the South, right? And so the question is, okay, well, you can't make just a general blanket statement about Nigerian immigrants, then, right? Some you would love to have in this country. Some would be less desirable. The same is true with Mexicans, right? Some are middle-class Mexicans, very intelligent, hard workers, and so on. And then you got some people who they couldn't make a go of it anywhere else, so they came here. So it's it's you need a system that looks at this in a much more discerning way. And I just don't. American national policy clearly doesn't do that well.
And politicians have a rather romantic position on the matter of immigration. So Nigerians, the Igbos do well in Nigeria, and they also do well outside of Nigeria. And the Igbos are more individualistic than other tribes in Africa. I have written on the topic. But what people rarely say about Nigeria as a country is that Nigeria is tribal. Africa is the most diverse region on the planet. Nigeria is particularly diverse, and Nigerians are tribal. They're tribal people, and they also take ancestry seriously. So even in the 21st century in Nigeria, if you are the descendant of a slave, that can pose a problem if you decide to marry to someone who is not a descendant of a slave. That can pose a problem. There is still a relatively high level of in-group trust and low out-group trust. There are also class issues. So even if we import the better educated Nigerians, these people are either Igbo or they are from Benin or Yoruba. They're not going to automatically integrate into the Black American society. They will not. And why would they? On average, Black Americans are not as educated as other groups. And as I said earlier, Nigeria has racial and class problems. So importing immigrants can compound political problems in the United States because many of these people, even when they are well educated, are coming from low trust countries where they literally only trust their friends and family members.
Well, and I think then that's another reason. Well, okay, two things, right? That obviously that betrays the uselessness of a blanket U.S. policy about Nigeria as a country overall, right? What does that tell us about everybody? Um, the same way with regional differences in any number of countries, right? As well as class differences, right? Middle class Mexicans have a lot in common with middle class Americans. Um, a a Mexican from the countryside who's always worked in agriculture and may not even read very well, that's a very different situation. And so the uselessness then of all Mexican immigrants are the same situation, it's just not very good public policy. But in terms of then people coming here, where they come from a low trust society, you need to address that then with more localized ideas where, look, you're in a community here that has a significant level of cohesion and you're expected to participate in the community here at a local level. And this isn't just some abstraction. That message needs to be sent, but the United States is just simply awful at that. And one of the weaknesses the United States has, now economists will tell you it's a strength because it drives more economic growth. And I speak of just the constant moving around that Americans do. Americans are certainly one of the most mobile societies in the world, if not the most, in terms of people are constantly moving around and not just moving to like a neighboring area, but moving just totally across the country, moving to a completely different region, leaving even their families behind. Heck, I know situations where parents get divorced and then one of the parents moves to a different time zone, leaving their children behind. It's astounding the ability that Americans show in just breaking all ties with a community they grew up with. And this is shown to have significant downsides in terms of suicide rates, in terms of success in school, in terms of happiness levels. It doesn't actually make people emotionally better off when they move to another place, unless they had significant problems where they were. Maybe they came from a criminal family or they were very poor where they were, and then they migrate and they make a lot more money, or they somehow make a go of it and become more successful. Because lots of migrants, they really do change their fortunes by changing, and there are lots of migrants within the United States, right? Native-born internal migrants. However, the data does suggest that the constant moving around leads to higher crime, to lower social cohesion, to a lower trust society, and all of these issues. And that, of course, is then going to bleed over to the migrant populations as well. When you don't even have a cohesive native population, well, how much can you ask then of migrants to integrate into that? It's almost an impossible task then.
It's a romantic view. They assume that white the assumption is that white Americans are racist, they're evil people, and all migrants are good people. When it's actually the other way around. It's more likely to be accurate when we look at the reverse.
Well,
White are
I don't have a romantic view of either of
Yeah,
those.
neither do I, neither do I. But white Americans are less invested in history and heritage relative to non-white Americans,
Well, and just
according to
speaking,
Pew.
sure. Well, and speaking of my Latin American relatives and ancestors, right? There's much more a cognizance of social class outside the United States, right? As well as race, right? Hispanics don't pretend to not see color or anything like that, right? Hispanics tend to be very cognizant of ethnic differences, racial differences within their own communities. They notice it. That doesn't mean that they treat people who are different from them like dirt, but it does mean that they're aware that people who look different, act different, speak different, um, perhaps cannot be trusted as easily, or that they have very different interests from you. And Latin Americans are more willing, both born here and from somewhere else, are more willing to admit that. I think like suburban white people in America who went to an American high school and so on, they've been told that never ever admit that you see differences in other people from different ethnic groups. And of course they see that, they feel the prejudice, which everybody everywhere on earth has. Everybody everywhere on earth feels prejudices against people who they suspect are different or coming from a different place, have different interests or priorities. And again, that doesn't mean everyone's going to start murdering each other,
No,
but these real differences, they have an effect. And most people in the world admit that. It's just I think a lot of Americans are afraid to admit it, and so pretend that none of those differences have any effect on anybody. And yeah, you're right, that's a very romantic view, to say the least.
it's a fallacy to say that immigrants won't change institutions because many of the new studies are touting this argument that immigration will not alter the nature of American institutions, but at the same time, there are several smaller studies arguing that there's a link between features of an immigrant and his economic outcome. So people from countries with a robust history of cooperation are more likely to succeed in America. So even if immigrants do not have a national impact on institutions at the community level, they definitely have an impact.
Oh, of course immigrants have impact. I mean, just look at the history of the 19th century, right? When you had waves of German immigrants come to the United States, and just massively swell the population. Of course, that had an effect on a variety of cultural levels. And then Italians in later waves, and then Asians. Of course, these all have effect. It would be silly to claim that everybody's essentially the same, or that they integrate, and that none of these differences remain afterwards. So yeah, it is remarkable that people even make those claims. And of course, Ludwig von Mises, being a diehard liberal who wanted openness to migration, openness to trade, integration between different groups, very cosmopolitan fellow. Nevertheless, of course, would never claim that people moving around did not have a cultural effect. He saw this at work in his home country of Austria-Hungary, where just in his day, urban populations were changing, the culture and politics were changing over time. And yeah, and how can you deny that someone who comes to the United States, say from Argentina. Now, Argentina has, of course, its problems, its corruption, its financial crises and stuff. But an Argentinian, they tend to, at least, even if they're not practicing Christian, they're familiar with the religion. They speak a European language. Their constitution is very similar to that of the United States. Now, theirs doesn't function as well. And I don't idolize the U.S. Constitution, but it obviously works better than the Argentinian one. And there's less corruption in the U.S. and so on. But there are enough similarities there that person is going to have a whole lot, especially if they're from Buenos Aires and they're more urban. They understand, they've been exposed to American culture already. That person's going to have a much different experience in the United States than is someone who's from like a small town, even in Eastern Europe, or someone who's from a rural area of Africa or in Southeast Asia. I mean, these are just very, very different situations that you can find yourself in. And of course, some make a go of it, though, right? Like Indians tend to do very well in the United States.
They do. The more Indians are educated, the most educated group in the States.
Well, I think the ones that come here, also, I'm not sure what populations they come from in India, right? But that raises the question of, right, they do better in America than they do better in India, right?
And
You
for
come here,
obvious
you get
reasons.
much richer.
India has a caste system. Economic freedom in India has improved since the 70s. That's a very old benchmark, but it still has bureaucratic issues. India is
Right,
a
not a
relatively
free market country by any
India
means,
is a relatively weak state.
and
So
big regional differences and
yes,
so on. And so, yeah, again, it's the whole issue of, sure, you would be insane to claim that a rural person who knows nothing of European languages or European religions is pretty much the same as someone who comes from an urban area in the Americas and has worked a middle class job in the past. I'm thinking of an Argentinian I know who went to engineering school in Argentina, right? And he moved here, and it wasn't that big a change for him, right? I mean, obviously he would tell him it. He would tell you it took time to integrate, to learn the language very, very well, and all of that sort of stuff. But I mean, there's just no comparison between that sort of movement and someone who came from a village in a faraway place that is not used to using any of the things that people in the first world use.
okay, right, Ryan. So I'm going to close this segment of the show and send another link so we can have a part two.
Okay.
All right.